Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. I recently had a viewer who wanted to know about John and his relationship with Aunt Mimi. That sounded like a good idea because recently I've done videos about Paul and his father, Paul and his mother, and George and his father and mother. So this time I thought it'd be good to see what happened in the case of John and his childhood. So the video lays out the groundwork in this episode of how circumstances led to Mimi taking over as a mother to John. So Mimi was so excited the night that John was born. It was October the 9th, 1940, and she kept calling the hospital for news. Her sister Julia was in labor for 30 hours. Poor lady. Outside, there were sirens going off due to landmine raids, and finally, when she called the hospital again, she found out that Julia had a boy. Mimi was so excited that she ran out of the house. She said nothing was going to stop her from getting to the hospital, not even Hitler. So Mimi said that John was a beautiful baby, and even the nurses said he was. He had blonde hair and he weighed 7.5 pounds. And Mimi said when she set eyes on him, she knew he was going to be something special. According to the book The Lives of John Lennon by Albert Goldman, Julia was 27 when she gave birth to John, and Julia was just like a kid despite her age. She was a funny person, and she was full of mischief, and she found love with a man named Alfred, or Alf Lennon. He was a ship's waiter. Julia's family didn't think very much of him, and Julia's father told her she needed to either break up with him or marry him. And it was then that Julia proposed to Freddie. So this didn't go the way that her father had planned. Instead of breaking up with Alf, she decided her and Alf should live together. So Alf was shocked by this. He said he'd been born in an orphanage and that they needed to get married in the proper way. And they both had a laugh with Julia saying she bet he wouldn't do it. And Alf said he did it as a joke. So that doesn't sound like a good way to begin a marriage. And Mimi remembered the day that they married. Julia walked in and said, "There, I've married him." And she threw the certificate on the table. So Mimi was cynical, stating, "We all knew nothing good would come of it, but there was no telling her. I don't think she ever thought about the consequences, and that was typical of her." And Julia's dad asked Julia and her husband to move in with them. He didn't want to lose his favorite daughter. Julia felt like she didn't have anyone's attention. Alf became a seaman in the war. Mimi was at her own home, and her mom died, and everyone was looking after the baby. So Mimi suggested that Julia move into a cottage near her house, and that was owned by Mimi's husband. So that was a mistake, because once Julia moved out of her family home, she began to hang out in the pubs, drinking and singing and hanging out with men. She couldn't afford a babysitter, so when John fell asleep, she would slip out to the pub. So when Alf came home from sea, he found out what Julia was up to, and he wasn't very happy about it. So Alf got on her, and she responded by pouring hot tea over his head. And he slapped her face, the only time he'd ever done that, and it caused her nose to bleed. So Mimi was called over because she used to be a nurse. So Mimi learned what was going on, and she got on Julia. And then Freddie, after returning home after a year, found out that Julia was pregnant with another man, a soldier named Taffy Williams. He wanted Julia to move away with him, but he didn't want John to come along. So Julia didn't want to leave John, and so she separated from Taffy Williams. So Julia's father didn't want a baby that would be born without having a legal dad. He said she would have to go, or the baby. So Julia decided to give up the baby, and Mimi made the arrangements. And she was going to go to a Salvation Army orphanage for girls close to her house. So John later on tried to find her without success, and she was renamed Ingrid Marie Peterson and raised in Norway. She was interviewed, and in 1966 she said her parents told her brother was a Beatle and her mother was Julia. So she was afraid to say anything until her adopted mother died, and then she said she would like to meet her sisters and any other relative of the family. And when asked if she would like to meet Yoko, she said yes, if she would. And then she said, "She's my sister-in-law, and you should meet your sister-in-law." So I don't know if she ever got together with any of them. I need to investigate more into that. So It was at this time that Alfred decided to send John to live with his brother Sidney, who lived north of Liverpool. And when Julia sent Victoria off to be adopted and she reconciled with Alfred, she told Alf to get John back. Sidney, his brother, said he didn't think the relationship would last and asked that John stay with him, but Alf wouldn't listen. So then Julia started seeing a friend of hers named John Dykins, and he made a good living and he loved to live well. And John didn't like Dykins. Julia never disciplined John, and he let his anger out on other kids. So John was about 5 years old when all this was happening. John got expelled from kindergarten because he was attacking the girls. So when Freddie returned again, he was met by Julia, John, and Julia's dad. And John Dykins and Alf got into a fight, and little John crept down the stairs to see the whole thing. Alf was thrown out of the house. Julia claimed she was moving in with Dykins and started to take the furniture out of the house and left Alf only a broken chair. Alf tried to patch up the marriage. He then had to go to his job as a night steward on the Queen Mary, and when he left, Julia moved back to the house, and she did that to convince Alf that their marriage was at an end. So this was all unsettling for John, and he would sometimes run away. And who did he run to? He ran to Mimi. So Mimi called Alf's ship to let him know that John had run away. John got on the phone and said he didn't like his new daddy, so Alf came back as fast as he could. So Alf decided to take John on a holiday to Blackpool for 6 weeks, and they had a great time bonding there, and Alf decided to go to New Zealand with John. Julia suddenly reappeared in the picture with Dykins. She said she was settled in with Dykins and wanted John back. Alf told her he wanted to immigrate to New Zealand with John. He told Julia she could go with him. And then Julia started a fight with him. Freddie then said it should be up to John to decide who he wanted to stay with. So John said he wanted to stay with his dad. So John runs to Alf and sits on his knee. Then John asked Alf if his mom was coming back, and Alf said no. And Alf told John he had to decide who he wanted to stay with. And John said he wanted to stay with Alf. So then Julia went out the door and was almost at the street when John ran after her. Alf said that was the last time he saw him until he became a Beatle. So Alf was still in love with Julia, and he loved John, so he decided to remain with jobs at sea. So John got disappointed. So once Julia and John got back home, Julia let Mimi become his foster mother, so John felt betrayed. He wanted a mother, not an aunt. And Julia's father didn't want John to grow up in an irregular household, so Julia was to stay out of sight so Mimi could raise John without confusing him. If Julia had divorced Alf, she could have married Dykins, and she had 2 kids by him, but she didn't do it because she knew Alf wouldn't agree to a divorce. So Alf was at sea for 14 months, and then he went to New Zealand, and after that he went back to England in 1949, and he decided he was going to get John back. But before he could speak with Julia, he decided he needed to get courage, so he got drunk while in London. And then he saw a red-haired mannequin in a store window and smashed it and started to dance with it in the street. So he was arrested, and since he couldn't pay a fine, he had to go to jail for 6 months. And Alf wrote to Mimi for help in getting John back. But when the letter came to him, he realized that Mimi was the one who was raising John and not Julia. So Mimi told Alf not to try and reclaim John, and if he tried to contact John, she would tell John his father was a felon and a convict. So being in jail meant that Alf could no longer work in the Merchant Navy, and he ended up traveling up and down the country, and he would work as a dishwasher in a hotel kitchen. So John stated that he soon forgot all about his dad, and he felt like he was dead. And John said he would see his mom from time to time, and he thought about her all the time, but Mimi made it sound like she was far away. But this is the kicker, come to find out, she was only 3 miles away. So I will end the video now. And the next video, we'll see what happens when John lives with his aunt and uncle. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. I wish everybody a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of the Beatles Forever. Thank you.